April 6, 1945, Okinawa, 0145 hours, and the Pacific night presses down on the ridge like a living thing as Corporal Eugene Jacobs crouches in his foxhole with a strange, untrusted weapon pressed against his cheek, staring through a rubber eye cup into a world that looks nothing like reality, nothing like the moonlit postcards of war that existed only in training manuals, but instead a grainy, green-tinted fog where shapes dissolve and certainty evaporates, where 20 minutes stretch into an eternity, and his eyes burn from concentration while his mind fights the suspicion that the lieutenant was right, that this is just another army experiment dreamed up by men far from the front who would never have to crawl into a muddy hole and listen to the jungle breathe around them, because for 4 long years American soldiers in the Pacific had learned one brutal truth above all others, that the night belonged to the Japanese, that after sunset the rules changed, that sound replaced sight, and silence replaced firepower, and that the enemy who emerged after dark was not the same enemy encountered by day, but something colder, quieter, and far more dangerous, trained since the 1930s to operate in absolute darkness, drilled in infiltration tactics along the Manchurian border in preparation for war with the Soviet Union, and perfected through campaigns in China and Southeast Asia where night fighting was not an exception but doctrine, a doctrine that produced devastating results at Guadalcanal, where 70% of Japanese attacks occurred between 2200–0400 hours, where American casualty ratios in night actions routinely reached 3-to-1 in Japan's favor, where flares illuminated friendly foxholes as clearly as enemy movement and searchlights drew artillery fire like magnets, where acoustic detectors could hear danger without giving soldiers anything to shoot at, and where official U.S. doctrine by late 1944 effectively surrendered half of every day to the enemy by ordering troops to stop patrolling after dark, dig in, and wait for daylight, a quiet admission that the U.S. Army and Marine Corps, for all their firepower and industrial might, were blind once the sun went down, a blindness born not of incompetence but of technology, culture, and training rooted in electric lights, paved streets, and wars fought in daylight, making the Pacific night feel primal, predatory, and hostile, a place where fear lived and knives found throats before rifles could fire, as Private James Hartley had learned months earlier on Guadalcanal when he fired blindly into darkness, revealed his position with muzzle flash, and was found at dawn with his throat cut, one of thousands whose deaths were not isolated incidents but predictable outcomes of a battlefield imbalance no amount of courage could overcome, an imbalance that haunted planners as Okinawa loomed. Because Okinawa was not jungle but open ground studded with coral ridges, limestone caves, and ancient burial tombs converted into fortresses, defended by the Japanese 32nd Army's 77,000 men, who had months to prepare and who were expected to bleed the invasion force dry through the same night infiltration tactics that had worked everywhere else, prompting a desperate cable from 10th Army headquarters to Washington requesting any technology capable of countering night movement, a request that bypassed traditional weapons designers and landed instead in Camden, New Jersey. On the desk of Dr. Vladimir Zworykin, a 56-year-old Russian immigrant electrical engineer who had never worn a uniform, never slept in a foxhole, never heard rustling grass and wondered if it was wind or death, but who had already changed the modern world by inventing the iconoscope, the television camera tube, and who years earlier had demonstrated an infrared image converter capable of turning invisible wavelengths of light into visible images on a phosphor screen, an idea that sounded like pulp science fiction to ordnance officers who had watched miracle weapons fail repeatedly in tropical mud, yet one that gained urgency after Pearl Harbor forced imagination into necessity, launching Project T-120 under strict secrecy with requirements that bordered on absurd given the state of 1943 electronics, demanding an infrared lamp invisible to the naked eye, a scope sensitive enough to detect reflected radiation, a power supply light enough for a soldier to carry, a total system, weight under 30 pounds, an effective range of at least 70 yards, and a development timeline of 18 months, all while vacuum tubes shattered easily, batteries were heavy and unreliable, and humidity destroyed electronics faster than bullets. Yet Zworykin did not argue, he built. And by December 1943 at Aberdeen Proving Ground, He placed a mannequin dressed in Japanese uniform 70 yards downrange on a moonless night and handed a skeptical colonel a prototype scope, through which a glowing human figure appeared out of total darkness, sharp enough to aim at, bright enough to kill, producing a single shot and a stunned silence broken only by the question of how fast 200 could be made, a question whose answer revealed the true battlefield to be not physics but manufacturing, because producing combat-ready systems meant hand-assembling delicate image tubes in clean rooms where dust ruined photocathodes, enduring rejection rates approaching 40%, coordinating supply chains across multiple states, training technicians, writing manuals for weapons soldiers had never seen before, inventing doctrine from scratch, and racing against time because Okinawa would not wait, forcing Captain Harold Morrison, a former high school physics teacher turned ordnance officer, to invent tactical use for a weapon whose limitations were as significant as its promise, discovering that battery life barely covered a single night's watch, that firing blinded the scope momentarily, that range beyond 70 yards dissolved into ambiguity, and that the only workable solution was a two-man team where one soldier saw and another shot. A clumsy compromise delivered through a rushed 2-week training program at Fort Benning before the invasion launched on April 1st, leaving 150 completed systems to arrive late, sit in crates while men died inland, and be distributed unevenly across units who greeted them with skepticism born of hard experience, until the night of April 5th, when Corporal Eugene Jacobs, selected partly because he understood electronics and partly because no one else wanted the 15-pound battery pack, crouched on a ridge 2 miles inland from Higuchi beaches, staring into green fog, convinced the thing was broken until movement appeared, first a crawling shape, then another, then more, advancing in disciplined spacing toward the American line, carrying satchel charges meant to explode foxholes from within, invisible to every other man on that ridge, forcing Jacobs to make a decision in seconds, flip a safety, fire a controlled burst, and watch a glowing figure collapse, then another, and another, as return fire erupted only after Americans already knew where to shoot, ending a 90-second firefight with 8 Japanese dead, 0 American casualties, and an entire defensive line saved. An engagement repeated across Okinawa's early days as reports showed that a weapon representing less than 1% of American small arms accounted for nearly 30% of enemy rifle casualties, a statistical anomaly so extreme it forced intelligence officers to reconsider everything they thought they knew about night combat, spreading demand faster than supply, altering morale wherever scopes were deployed, and even forcing Japanese units to alter infiltration routes to avoid positions rumored to hold magic light. Yet Okinawa proved merciless to imperfection, because when the monsoon arrived, rain destroyed electronics. Humidity fogged tubes, batteries leaked acid, maintenance proved impossible in combat conditions, and terrain shifted south into ridges and caves where 70-yard visibility meant nothing, forcing commanders to shelve the scopes and return to flares and searchlights as casualties climbed again, prompting ordnance reports that condemned weather vulnerability and limited range while overlooking the lives already saved, effectively shelving the program just as planners turned toward invading. Japan, devastating Zworykin, who had delivered exactly what he promised, yet learned that in military bureaucracy, not perfect often means discarded. Even as soldiers like Jacobs wrote home that the scope was heavy, fragile, and unreliable but had kept dozens alive, a truth buried beneath paperwork until post-war analysis revealed the full picture. That despite failures, the M3 sniper scope saved an estimated 600 to 900 American lives, achieved unprecedented effectiveness, and proved that seeing first mattered more than numbers, a lesson resurrected in Korea where improved versions finally fulfilled the promise Okinawa previewed, validating the idea that night need not belong to the enemy, an idea born not from battlefield experience but from an engineer who understood that light existed beyond human vision, and who believed that if soldiers could see in darkness, fewer would die. A belief proven on April 6, 1945, when one exhausted corporal on a Pacific island looked through a green glowing scope and ended 4 years of surrender to the night, demonstrating that the impossible is often simply the possible waiting long enough for someone stubborn enough to make it real.